Good morning, everyone. As Dan said, my name is Fred Siggins. I am the strategy manager for Sullivan's Cove Distillery in Hobart, Tasmania. And if you guys haven't heard about us, we make whiskey. We are a tiny craft operation making single malt style whiskey as well as vodka and gin from 100% Tasmanian ingredients using very small scale and old-fashioned production methods. And to put it mildly, demand for our product is massive. I spend a lot of my day just fielding phone calls and emails from all over the world requesting our product. Most of those requests I can't fulfill because we simply don't have enough whiskey. On any given day, I could easily sell the entirety of what we produce in a year with one phone call. On a day-to-day basis, it is sort of normal for me to be working in this situation where my product is in such massive demand, but it's my job to sort of take a step back and ask myself, how did this happen? What does it say about the world that we're living in that out of the thousands of whiskey distilleries all over the world, a tiny place at the arse end of nowhere that's not particularly well known for making whiskey could become so well known and become so successful? We've never spent any money on marketing. We only have a few thousand followers on social media. We've never paid for a single article or print ad. There are a few things that have contributed to this situation, which I'm going to talk to you about this morning. Some important cultural trends which kind of drive a little business like ours. But the first thing that I need to mention is something that really kind of picked us up in the entire Tasmanian and Australian whiskey industries and turned it into a global phenomenon. And that was in 2014, we won the award for Best Single Malt Whiskey in the World at the World Whiskies Awards. Thank you. Yeah, it was good. We were the first and still the only Australian whiskey to be given that title, and at the time we were the only whiskey distillery outside of either Scotland or Japan to win the award. We beat them all. These are folks that have been making whiskey for hundreds of years with multi-million-dollar facilities and hundreds upon thousands of barrels of whiskey to choose from when they're entering these awards. To give you an idea of scale, I'll use an example of a small single malt Scotch whiskey distillery, of which there are about 120 currently operating. Brooklady, relatively small distillery that produces 1.5 million litres of pure alcohol every year, which is going to give them somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 4 million bottles of whiskey that they're producing on an annual basis. Like I said, this is a small single malt Scotch whiskey distillery. We produce 20,000 bottles of whiskey a year, meaning that what Brooklady make in one day would take us 6 months to produce. And again, we beat these guys and everybody like them. They're also on an island that's been making single malt whiskey for about 500 years, where we've only been doing it for about 20. It says a lot about the way that the world is these days that we were able to do that, and it had such a massive impact on our business. If it wasn't for the internet and social media, the awards that we've received would have had a far smaller impact. For example, in this room of about 300 people or so, there might only be a handful, hopefully a little bit more at this point, who really care about single malt whiskey and are really passionate about it. But we can form online communities that might be millions strong on a global level, even if only there's a handful of people in any particular given location. The digital age, everyone can be connected like that, and everyone has access to information on the best and most interesting whiskeys, so it drives people to form those niche communities. From there, it tends to disseminate into the broader population because there aren't really that many barriers to entry into these online communities. If you were to join one of the old-fashioned whiskey clubs, you might sort of feel like you have to be of a particular demographic to really fit in there. But on the internet, it's much more kind of egalitarian. And then that information tends to disseminate out into the broader population a lot more easily. The kind of media attention that we get can have massive reach, because you don't have to be a subscriber to Whiskey Magazine to see an article posted online. And who's not going to click on a link that's going to tell you about the best single malt whiskey in the world? So the point is that these days, no matter where you are or how small you are, if you've got a really good product, people are going to find out about you. So the interconnected nature of these niche communities is one of the trends that really drives a business like ours. The second trend I want to talk about is something that can be seen across the food and drinks industry, and that's the return to provenance, which we've already sort of mentioned today. People want to know where their food comes from, how it's made, and who made it. People want a real connection between land, ingredients, and a final product, and an artisan making things on the basis of craft and passion, and not just on the basis of the bottom line. And trust me, when it comes to Tasmanian whiskey, we never would have survived the first 15 years of the business if it was about money, because we had a really hard time convincing people that Tasmanian whiskey was a thing. These days, though, for the vast majority of human history, of course, everybody was eating local craft stuff. People were drinking the wine that was produced in their local village. You had greengrocers and butchers selling locally raised meat and vegetables. You had whiskey being made almost exclusively for the local community. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, and more importantly, the World Wars, that the food industry was sort of consolidated and scaled. The beer in Melbourne is a really good example of this. Before the World Wars, you had tiny breweries in each neighbourhood, Abbotsford, Collingwood, Richmond, Carlton, each making sort of traditional styles of beer with locally grown barley. But when the World Wars came, the government basically needed that barley to feed the troops. So the small breweries were all basically forced to either consolidate or shut down and go out of business. Notice that's why the one big brewery that we still have in Melbourne is called the Carlton and United Breweries, because it was all the other breweries conglomerating together. Of course, the vast majority of the grains had to go to the troops to be sold, so what that big brewery was left with was the leftovers that they could use to fulfill a government contract for brewing beer to send out to the troops. That's why you end up with this really light, pretty flavourless style of lager that dominated the Australian beer industry for the entirety of the 20th century. The same thing happened with dairy, with meat, with canned and frozen vegetables, and with the global supply chains that developed as a result of the World Wars, making it super easy to import food from wherever. Now, of course, that's all changing, and we're sort of going back to this idea of understanding where our food comes from and who makes it, the sort of provenance. So that's something that's really important to a business like ours, because we're right down there in Tassie. You can come and visit us, you can meet our head distiller, you can have an understanding of how the product is made and why we make it the way that we do. The third trend in this story goes hand in hand with the return to provenance. And again, it's something we've talked about a little bit already, and that's the idea of creating an experience around our food and drink. We can see this everywhere. A quick walk down Chapel Street will show you that traditional retail is kind of moving out, but experience-based businesses like bars and restaurants and barbershops are thriving. Especially in the drinks world, people don't just want to spend their money on something that'll get them drunk as quickly and cheaply as possible anymore. All the data over the last 10 years tells us that Australians are drinking less, but drinking better, and so actually spending the same amount of money. Look at how many cocktail bars and wine bars and whiskey bars now there are compared to 10 years ago. We've got festivals devoted to obscure wines, bars dedicated entirely to esoteric spirits, sold out masterclasses like the ones I run with Claire, who you'll hear from in a minute. She's built an entire business not around selling wine, but around selling the experience that surrounds wine as an idea. People want to feel like they're drinking something special, like they're part of an environment, they're getting something unique and new, and that there's a story to be told. I worked for years as a cocktail bartender, and I always used to tell people that I wasn't in the business of selling booze, that that's what bottle shops do. As a bartender working in a high-end cocktail bar, I was in the business of selling experience. And one of the cool things about these experiences is that they're accessible. It's not an elitist thing. We're not talking about always having to have the best and the finest in the world, because with my hard-earned $20, I can walk into the best whiskey bar or the best cocktail bar in the city, have one drink, savor it, get an experience and a story around it, and remember it, rather than smashing 4 pots of the same tasteless beer I've had every day for my adult life, just so I can do the same thing again tomorrow. So, when you get to a point where you're selling bottles of whiskey from anywhere from $170 to $450 a bottle, which we do, it's not about the liquid anymore. It's about everything that surrounds it. At Sullivan's Cove, we're lucky because the story is already there, and it's a good one. But it is something we have to keep working on. We can't just sit back and watch the dollars roll in because we won a big award a few years ago. There are now more than 30 whiskey distilleries in Australia, so if we don't continue to engage and entertain and educate and inspire our fans, we will simply lose them. But as the chief storyteller for Sullivan's Cove, I'm not worried about it, because everything we do is based around giving somebody a new story to take back to that community of whiskey lovers that they're a part of, to give them a true understanding of what's in the bottle and how it's made and why we make it, and to give everybody the best possible experience every time they crack open a bottle of that beautiful, sweet Tasmanian liquid gold. So I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to do it for the next 20 years and the next 20 years after that. Thank you.